Hello there. Pope Francis, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Bishop of Rome, has died. He was the first pope from both the Western Hemisphere and South America, ascending to the papacy in 2013 as the figurehead of the world's 1.3 billion Roman Catholics.
Well, Cameron Walker takes a look back on the life of an extraordinary man.
March 2013, and Jorge Mario Bergoglio stood on the balcony of St. Peter's in Rome and said a simple buonasera.
Fratelli e sorelle, grazie tante dell'accoglienza.
It was the start of a very different pontificate from his predecessor Benedict, who'd retired from his onerous duties. The former Archbishop of Buenos Aires was the first pope to take the name of Francis, the saint of the poor and of nature. He was, though, to usher in a time of richer relations with his worldwide congregation, both in style and substance. And that soon became evident as he made his presence in the Vatican more accessible. Gone were the grand papal apartments. He moved to the Casa Santa Marta to live simply with others. When he visited the headquarters of the EU, he did so in a battered car, and a more informal approach echoed the approach of John Paul II. The carnival is over, he declared, referring to the Vatican's cliques and factions. There was instead a whirling circus of high-profile media appearances. The Pope wanted to be part of the modern world. He was clearly spontaneous and open. When asked about homosexuality, he answered, "Who am I to judge?" But did indeed pass judgment publicly on those who had been abused.
Faccio un sentito appello per la lotta a tutto campo contro gli abusi di minori nel campo sessuale come in altri campi, da parte di tutte le autorità e delle singole persone, perché si tratta di crimini abominevoli che vanno cancellati dalla faccia della terra.
This was one of his earliest challenges, how to deal with the spectre of child abuse that had hung over the Catholic Church. His papacy became an opportunity to end decades of evasion and cover-ups. But traditionalists were fearful of his modernizing tendencies, affirming in their view, when he banned the Latin Mass, a form of liturgy popular with conservative Catholics.
Buon pranzo e arrivederci.
He went on to speak one then of Muslims as brothers, and was vocal in his support of migrants, even taking in some families to live in the Vatican itself. He also pitted himself against African Orthodox bishops on the issue of homosexuality, where Pope Francis went further than his predecessors. Although he never actually blessed the concept of gay marriage, he appeared to observe the rule of love above the rule of law. In a documentary for the Disney Plus channel, he also reflected that priests should be merciful towards women seeking an abortion. As the world was gripped by the COVID crisis, Francis publicly encouraged all Catholics to get vaccinated. He called this a small gesture of love in poverty, at a time when skepticism was sweeping parts of the globe. But the death toll was rising, especially across his home continent of South America. He felt the need for practical as well as spiritual leadership. With the invasion of Ukraine, the Vatican needed to deliver its own message in the war of words between Russia and the West.
Questa bandiera viene dalla guerra, proprio da quella città martoriata, Bucha.
Pope Francis denounced the wake of death and destruction, describing the war as a crime against God and humanity. He warned of a rising nuclear threat, echoing the views of millions when he said the world once more feels fear and anguish.
Per favore, non dimentichiamo di pregare per la martoriata Ucraina.
But despite this continued spiritual strength, his physical being was weakening. Knee problems left him using a wheelchair for long periods. In the summer of 2021, he underwent abdominal surgery, and then bronchitis hospitalized him in the spring of 2023. It was acknowledgement of his increasing frailty. He felt a malaise, he said, but I wasn't afraid. And he continued with his duties in all humility. He had admitted drafting a letter of resignation in the event of illness, making it impossible for him to continue with his duties as Benedict had done. But then, in a more recent interview, he reflected he had no real intention of taking that step. His ministry, he said, was his life.
Well, our thoughts and prayers for the Holy Father there. This is absolutely incredible because only yesterday we were all watching the Holy Father address the crowds there in St. Peter's Square. And the address, he said a few words, like literally a few words, and then it was taken over by a cardinal who was to say the same thing. But he didn't look dying. And we've got a situation, was it 25 to 8 this morning, they found him in bed.
Yeah, I mean, that was highly anticipated, wasn't it, that appearance yesterday? As you say, he just managed to say,
he looked relatively
Happy Easter.
well.
He did look frail, didn't he? And as you say, the clergyman...
I didn't look as if he was going to die. But
I think it was highly anticipated. He wanted to be there to wish those people there in St. Peter's Square a happy Easter, and that he managed to do. But we have had this statement from the Vatican this morning saying, "Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 a.m. this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite, merciful love of the one true God."
Yeah.
And these are the pictures of him just yesterday addressing the crowds in St. Peter's Square. He obviously had the strength to be able to do that. And the crowds were so delighted to see him. The first time he'd been seen publicly in 5 weeks.
Yeah.
You remember he went into hospital on Valentine's Day with a lung infection, led to pneumonia. And there were many days in that hospital stay where it was touch and go, where it looked as though we may lose the Holy Father.
So we've only known this news for 90 minutes or so. Let's get reaction now as it comes in. Stephen Kurt is a vicar of Christ Church, that's in New Malden in Surrey. Stephen, although we're saying it was expected, big shock, isn't it?
Tremendously sad news. I'm a member of the Church of England, but I have huge admiration for Pope Francis and for everything that he brought, not just for Roman Catholic Christians throughout the world, but for all Christians throughout the world. He was an utterly inspirational figure. And it was his generosity, his simplicity, and particularly his passion for social justice. And what's really remarkable is that he was someone who had a real change over that. He, in his younger days, was quite reactionary, and he was someone who went a real process of repentance over some of the views that he'd taken earlier on in life, and became an absolute passionate advocate of social justice, particularly when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. So he wouldn't use all the official transport, he used public transport. He was an outspoken critic of social injustice. And I've got a quote which he said as Pope, which I think is wonderful. He said, "The poor are the treasure of the church. If we lose this vision of things, we will have a lukewarm, weak, and mediocre church. Our true power must be service. We cannot adore God if our spirit does not include the needy." And he also said these words, "I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it's been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security." So I think he was a wonderful man. And
being out on the streets, Stephen, was important to him. I mean, that idea that he would mix with ordinary people and the church was nothing if it didn't relate to those ordinary people.
Absolutely. Well, he drew his inspiration from the example showed by Jesus Christ, who was someone who completely interacted with those who were on the margins, gave a dignity and an importance to those who were vulnerable and largely ignored. And one of the reasons the reason why he took the title Pope Francis was because he wanted to recall Francis of Assisi. And he was, the first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere, from Argentina. He was the first Jesuit Pope. He was the first one to take the name St. Francis. But I think it is, as I say, this commitment to simplicity and particularly this passion for social justice and being really outspoken about it that will make him go down in history.
Stephen Kurt, thank you so much for your reflections on a remarkable man, a remarkable Pope there. Let's get the thoughts of former chaplain to Queen Elizabeth II, Dr. Gavin Ashenden. Good to see you this morning, Doctor, and such sad news this morning.
Yes, it's both a shock and expected at the same time. Sometimes things can be paradoxical. We knew he was very ill. We were glad he's recovered, and but whenever someone dies, it's always a shock, and particularly with somebody as significant as in the office holder of a pope, it's a beginning of a new era, of course, and that in itself is seismic.
Was just that. There was to be a meeting with King Charles and Queen Camilla this week, which didn't happen. But he did meet the American Vice President J.D. Vance.
Yes, that's quite extraordinary. Not just because he's the Vice President, but because J.D. Vance represented, he was a convert to Catholicism. Yeah. He came from a political angle that wasn't the same as Cardinal Bergoglio's as he was, and there's no, we know that there isn't much, there wasn't a great deal of sympathy from the Vatican towards the new administration in America. So J.D. Vance was clearly trying to pay his respects and build as many bridges as he could in that meeting, and it's quite extraordinary that meeting must be one of the last ones the Pope ever had.
Extraordinary as well that Pope Francis was able to be in St. Peter's Square yesterday to wave to the crowds, to give that short message saying Happy Easter to my brothers and sisters. I mean, even giving thumbs up to the crowd. It is the most important feast in the Christian calendar, and he was able to be there just yesterday.
Yes, I think people will be very grateful for that, and it's a very fitting. It's a send-off. It's not quite the right word, but I mean, it's very fitting that he should have been able to be there as Pope the day before he died.
Gavin, he wasn't typical of what we expect a Pope to be. He was very ordinary in so many ways and yet extraordinary. What did you make of the man?
Well, to be honest, this is a very difficult question. When someone dies, we want to speak as well of them as we can, hoping that people will speak as well of us. But on principle, the trouble is there are so many sides to Pope Francis, and not only to him as a man, but to what he represented in the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church is experiencing all the same tensions that the whole of the rest of our society is, and we know how difficult that is for everybody. He had some very attractive strengths. You've already heard people talk about his accessibility, his humanity, the fact he was down to earth. There are things about ecclesiastical flummery that no one likes, and he was really quite good at dispensing with them, sort of a man of the people, as you quite rightly say.